I had to discuss the electrolytes in the video after this drawing. So, and if you remember in the electrolyte video, I talked about the two main electrolytes that are involved in a muscle contraction, that being phosphate and calcium. So we're gonna give this board a quick flip. Now, if you haven't, what I'm talking about here. But moving forward, we're gonna talk about the contraction process. And before we get to that, there are two more terms or substances that I need to talk about that is important to the contraction. We're gonna talk about ADP and ATP. Now, a whole video can be done on these alone, but that's gonna be another time. So we're just gonna talk about ADP and ATP, what it does, and why it's important to the contraction process. So ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The main differences between the two is that diphosphate means that it has 2 phosphate groups, and triphosphate means that it has 3 phosphate groups. Now, they have a whole chemical formula behind that, but we're not gonna get into that again. That's another video. So just understand the root word here is phosphate. And if you remember what I just said, phosphate is one of the main electrolytes, or one of the 2 most important electrolytes that are involved specifically with the cross bridge development and muscle contraction. All right, now the fun stuff. We're gonna talk about action potential. Now, action potential is a change in electrical activity that results from a nerve impulse that leads to a muscle contraction. So you can think of an action potential like an electrical jolt to get things going. That's basically what it is. And then once that occurs, 3 phases of a muscle contraction. All right, the 3 phases. You have what's called the latent phase. Then you have the contraction. Then you have the relax. Now, the latent phase is where most of your setup occurs. During the latent phase, this is where the calcium ions, that's one of the 2 major electrolytes, diffuses throughout the cell from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the transverse tubules. And if you don't know what those are, go back and watch my release throughout the cell. And then you have the actual contraction phase. Now, the contraction phase is when tension occurs throughout the muscle. So this right here, okay, you have the latent phase right here. Calcium goes throughout the sarcoplasm, which is like the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. And then phase 2, which is the contraction phase right here. And then you have the relax phase, which is what it is, relax. And all of this happens within the millisecond. So very, very fast. You know, whenever they talk about faster or as fast as a blink of an eye, the action potential occurs at very high speeds. And a lot of this happens at very high speeds. So I'm gonna erase that. I hope you got that. Now we're gonna get into the anatomy of the 3 phases of the muscle contraction, of the thick and thin filaments. So what we're gonna do right here, I'm just gonna draw a line. This is the thin filament. And then I'm gonna draw a red line, which is gonna represent the thick troponin and tropomyosin. Now, if you remember from the flipping of the board or from the previous video when I talked about the components of the muscle contraction, these act as slots for this thick filament right here. So this is the thin filament, this is the thick filament. Now, I'm gonna draw out the actin, troponin, and tropomyosin here. Now, I'm gonna draw a blue. Now, the troponin is what the myosin connects to. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna color the troponin a different color. I'm gonna make it red. And this line going through them right here, that's the tropomyosin. So, quick review, I'm gonna label all of these. This green line right here is tropomyosin. I'm gonna call it Tropo for short. And then this circle is your actin. And then the center or the binding site, that's your troponin. Now, I'm gonna draw another line here. And I'm gonna draw an even more simplified version of this. Now, once calcium is released, it's gonna take this tropomyosin, which is this green line right here. I'm gonna draw Ca plus here to represent the calcium. This calcium is going to move this troponin. I'm sorry, it's gonna move this tropomyosin and reveal the troponin. And remember, the troponin is this red dot right here. And then I'm gonna draw the thick filament down here, which is gonna represent the connection between the thick and thin filaments right here. Now, once that happens, you have what's called your bridge formation, or at least the beginning of the bridge formation. And then during this process, ADP and phosphate is released. And then once that occurs, just gonna draw an arrow over here. ATP is created. And once ATP is created, the myosin is going to detach from the troponin. Getting my colors mixed up, I apologize. Now, once that detaches, the ATP is going to hydrolyze back into ADP. And then once that occurs, you have the relaxation phase, and everything goes back to normal. So everything that I've described here, from ATP, action potential, and the actin, troponin, tropomyosin, how it connects, how calcium comes in, and then how ADP comes into play, and then converts into ATP, which breaks it back down and goes into relaxation phase. All right, so that is the muscle contraction process. You have the action potential, then you have the latent phase, which is this phase right here, where the actin, troponin, tropomyosin is sitting inert, and then calcium comes in and peels that tropomyosin back to reveal the troponin, and that's where the myosin comes in and connects to the troponin of the actin molecule right here, or the actin part right here. And then once it connects, ADP and an extra phosphate is then released, and then it converts into ATP. Now remember, ADP is 2 phosphate groups, and then when an extra phosphate group comes in, it's gonna make ATP. And then once ATP is formed, it's gonna separate the myosin from the troponin, and then it goes into relaxation phase. So that's pretty much the process of the contraction. And that's all I have for you as of now. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about ADP and ATP and where it comes from and the chemical makeup of it. All right. See you in the next module.